It was an autumn afternoon when four friends, Alice, Pedro, Sofia, and Lucas, decided to escape their routine and venture into an abandoned camp in the heart of a dense forest. The place was known by everyone in the city as the Shadow Camp. It was said to be cursed, home to restless spirits, and haunted by dark events that occurred decades ago. Curiosity and the desire for excitement overcame the fear that the stories generated, and so they ventured into the unknown. The forest was at its autumn peak. The orange and red leaves created a thick carpet on the ground, making each of the friends' steps a whispering sigh. The sun's rays filtered through the trees, creating patterns of light and shadow that danced around them. The air was filled with an unsettling silence, broken only by the soft sounds of nature and the rustling of leaves beneath your feet. The winding trail took them deeper and deeper into the forest, and the dark camp seemed farther away than they imagined. As they got closer, they began to notice that the nature around them seemed reticent to accept intruders. Branches reached out like skeletal fingers towards them, as if the forest itself was trying to stop them from continuing. Finally, with the sun hanging low on the horizon, they came across the camp. It was covered in cobwebs and dry leaves, as if no one had visited it in years. The huts were in ruins, with broken windows and doors creaking in the wind. The deterioration of the place gave a feeling of desolation that contrasted with the beauty of the surrounding forest. They chose the central hut as their base. The wood creaked beneath their feet as they entered, and the air was damp and musty. The friends began setting up their tents outside, laughing and joking about the ghosts that supposedly inhabited the place. After all, they were skeptical of ghost stories and spirits. While Pedro and Lucas set up the tents, Alice and Sofia explored the abandoned cabins, intrigued by the traces of the past they found. Broken furniture, scraps of old newspapers, and faded photographs were all that remained of those who once attended the camp. However, as the sun sank below the horizon and night began to set in, the cheerful mood began to change. The wind began to howl through the trees, and the sky quickly darkened, as if the camp was in its own bubble of darkness. Mysterious sounds echoed through the forest, making everyone feel like they were being watched, but no one wanted to admit the fear that was growing in their hearts. Pedro lit a fire, but the feeling of being watched persisted. Shadows moved at the edges of their vision, disappearing as they tried to focus on them. The trees around the camp seemed to close in, casting eerie shadows over the site. Even the crackling fire couldn't completely dispel the feeling that they weren't alone. The stories they heard from the locals about the dark camp began to come back to mind. Tales of mysterious disappearances, whispering voices in the night, and sightings of shadowy figures. Everything seemed to make sense now, and the fun they had had before arriving at camp was slowly being replaced by genuine fear. The unknown was all around him, and whatever it was waiting in the shadows. The night at dark camp dragged on, and the group of friends was determined not to let fear dominate their adventure. They decided to light a fire in the center of the camp, hoping to light up the place and dispel any feeling of darkness that surrounded them. Pedro and Lucas offered to look for firewood in the nearby forest. As they ventured into the darkness with lit torches, Alice and Sofia began to hear distant whispers. At first, they seemed to be just the natural sounds of the forest, but they soon became clearer and more disturbing. The whispers seemed to be in constant motion, as if they were voices whispering unintelligible words from all directions. Alice and Sofia exchanged worried glances, unable to determine the source of these disturbing sounds. It seemed impossible to know where they were coming from, and the feeling of being watched was intensifying. When Pedro and Lucas returned with their arms full of firewood, they found Alice and Sofia looking pale and agitated. The two talked about the whispers they heard, but the boys thought it was just a figment of their imagination and the sounds that the night forest could create. "You're letting these scary stories get to you," Pedro said, trying to calm his friends down. "It's just our imagination running wild in the darkness." However, as the fire crackled and light filled the camp, everyone realized something wasn't right. Shadows danced in the trees around the camp, moving unnaturally, as if they had a life of their own. It was as if the forest was alive with a hidden, unsettling presence. Alice and Sofia looked around, their eyes narrowing as they tried to discern the shapes moving in the darkness. "You guys are seeing this, right?" Sofia asked, her voice shaking. Pedro and Lucas followed their gaze, seeing the shadows twisting in the trees. These were no ordinary shadows. They had a three-dimensional quality, as if something was moving inside. The silence that enveloped the camp only increased the feeling that they were being watched by invisible eyes. They approached the fire, trying to warm themselves and shake off the shivers running down their spines. At this moment, an inhuman and chilling sound erupted from the forest. It was like a distant cry, a lament that seemed to echo through the trees. Everyone turned toward the sound, their faces pale with fear. The crying seemed to get closer, an ominous presence in the darkness. The flames of the bonfire danced and wavered, as if they too were afraid of what was approaching. Lucas, bravest of the four, stood up and shouted towards the forest. "Who is there? Show yourself." The crying suddenly stopped, and the forest became silent again. There was no answer, just the thick darkness and the whispering wind. "This is too much," Alice whispered, her nervous gaze darting from the forest to her friends. "We're not alone here. Something's wrong in this place." Pedro, who'd been the most skeptical from the beginning, was now starting to question his decision to camp at the dark camp. "Maybe we'd better leave early tomorrow," he suggested, trying to hide the fear he felt. But before they could make any decisions, a terrifying sound echoed from the heart of the forest, a sound that made their hearts run cold. It was a scream, an anguished, agonized scream that seemed to echo throughout the forest, reverberating in their minds and filling them with terror. They clung to each other, unable to discern the source of that horrible scream. The dark camp had turned out to be a far more sinister place than they could have ever imagined, and they were just beginning to understand that they were not the only adventurers that night. Whatever it was that watched and tormented them in the shadows was becoming more and more real and terrifying. They now faced the night, fearing the unknown that surrounded them. The anguished scream echoed through the forest, leaving the friends petrified with fear. It didn't sound like a human scream. It was a supernatural lament that seemed to transcend reality itself. Lucas was the first to regain his courage and shouted, "We have to find out what's going on." With torches in hand, they advanced toward the source of the scream. The forest seemed to envelop them, its gnarled trees closing in behind them, obscuring their way back. It was as if the forest itself was conspiring to keep them trapped. The anguished crying continued, guiding them towards a clearing in the heart of the forest. As they approached, the sounds of nature were replaced by the sound of dry leaves beneath their feet, as if the earth itself was crying along with the unearthly scream. Finally, they arrived at the clearing, illuminated by moonlight. The place was enveloped in a deep silence, and in the center of the clearing, there was a hooded figure with his back to them, sobbing. The crying was low and desperate, echoing in the darkness. Pedro, with the torch in his hand, approached slowly, trying to appear brave. He reached out and touched the figure's shoulder. The skin was cold as death, and the figure trembled under his touch. Slowly, she turned to face them. What the friends saw at that moment filled them with terror. The hooded figure's face was pale, almost cadaverous, with empty, lifeless eyes, like two dark sockets. There was no mouth, just a black slit where the lips should have been. She looked at them with empty eyes and let out a whispering moan, like the whine of the wind through the trees. Everyone screamed in terror and backed away, letting the torch fall to the ground. In the blink of an eye, the figure disappeared, like smoke in the wind, leaving the friends alone in the moonlit clearing. The air was thick with the feeling that something terrible had happened in this place, something that did not belong to this world. Desperate, they tried to run back to camp, but the forest seemed to have turned into a maze of twisted trees and paths that led nowhere. They were lost in the darkness, their torches revealing only trees tightly packed around them. "What was that?" Sophia whispered, her eyes filled with terror. "We can't stay here anymore," Lucas said, trying to remain calm. "We have to find a way out of this forest." With heavy hearts, they continued to wander through the dark forest, desperately searching for a way out. The whispering sounds returned, as if the forest itself was mocking them, whispering dark secrets they could not understand. Time seemed distorted in that dark forest. Sometimes it felt like they had walked for hours, and other times only minutes had passed. The feeling of being watched never left them, and the shadows seemed to move, always lurking in the corners of their eyes. Eventually, after a desperate journey, they arrived at a decrepit cabin they didn't recognize from the camp. It looked like an old, abandoned refuge, with mossy walls and broken windows. They had no choice but to go and hoping to find a map or some clue that would lead them back home. Inside the cabin, they found dusty diaries and old notes. They leafed through the yellowed and stained pages and discovered that the cabin was, in fact, a place where participants in the original camp held dark meetings and rituals decades ago. The notes mentioned a summoning ritual that should remain buried and forgotten. The ritual was said to have been the cause of all the horrors that occurred at the dark camp. As the friends read the written words, they realized that whatever they had awakened that night was somehow related to this ritual. With heavy hearts, they realized they were in a situation they did not fully understand, and their lives were in the hands of dark forces that seemed unfathomable. Now, the only thing that mattered was finding a way to escape the dark camp, if that was possible. Inside the abandoned cabin, the air was heavy with the weight of dark camp's dark past. Friends read old notes and diaries, revealing details of macabre rituals that had been carried out in that place decades ago. Every word written increased the feeling that something terrible had been awakened that night. Pedro was determined to find a way out. He quickly read the notes and realized that the ritual they had performed was linked to supernatural forces that should never have been disturbed. We have to undo what was done. It's our only hope of getting out of this nightmare. The friends agreed, as they now had no choice but to face whatever was threatening them. They began searching the cabin for clues that could help them undo the ritual. They found candles, strange symbols drawn on the floor, and detailed notes about the procedure. While reading one of the notes, Sophia turned pale. It says here that we need a personal object to undo the ritual, something that has a deep meaning to whoever possessed it. Everyone began to rummage through the cabin in search of a personal item that might be of use. Lucas found a dusty box hidden under a pile of old newspapers. Inside was an old photograph of a smiling family, apparently taken at the dark camp itself. "That should do it," said Pedro, looking at the photo carefully. "It's a personal item, and from what it says in the notes, it should be enough to undo the ritual." The friends gathered in the center of the hut, around the candles and symbols drawn on the floor. With the photograph in hand, they began to follow the instructions in the notes. Pedro recited words that were almost unintelligible, while Sophia lit the candles. The atmosphere was charged with tension, and they could feel the dark presence around them. As the ritual continued, they began to hear distant whispers, as if the forest was responding to the ritual. The shadows on the cabin walls seemed to writhe, and the feeling that something was approaching came over them. Suddenly, the photograph Pedro was holding began to shine brightly, emitting a warm, comforting light. Light spread throughout the cabin, driving away the shadows and whispers. The friends felt incredible relief, but they knew they couldn't let their guard down. When the ritual was completed, the photo returned to its normal state, and the candles went out. The surroundings were silent again, as if the forest itself was waiting to see what would happen next. They left the cabin and, to their surprise, found themselves back at the original campsite where they had pitched their tents. The feeling of darkness and terror was gone, replaced by a sense of relief. However, the night was still far from over. The friends realized that they were not alone in the camp. Shadowy, hooded figures began to emerge from the shadows, slowly advancing towards them. "What the hell are those things?" whispered Lucas, his heart pounding with fear. Pedro held the photograph in his hands and muttered, "The ritual may have kept them away temporarily, but they don't seem to like it. We need a plan to keep us safe." Sophia pointed to the forest. "Let's run. Maybe we can find help or escape this forest once and for all." With a quick agreement, they turned and began running towards the darkness of the forest, the shadowy figures following closely behind them. They ran as fast as they could, their feet trampling the dry leaves that covered the ground. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, and the feeling that something was chasing them was overwhelming. As they ran, the friends noticed that the forest was changing around them. The trees seemed to twist and move, as if they were trying to stop them from escaping. Branches and roots seemed to reach towards them, creating obstacles with every step. As the forest became increasingly dense and dark, they began to get lost. With no idea where they were going, panic began to set in. The whispers in the night returned, filling his ears with indistinct, threatening words. When they finally reached a small stream that ran through the forest, the friends stopped to catch their breath. The shadowy figures had disappeared, but the feeling that they were being watched persisted. "What the hell is going on here?" Alice asked, her voice shaking. Pedro looked at the photograph he still held in his hands. "I think we've disturbed something that should have remained dormant, and now we're stuck in this nightmare. We have to find a way out, no matter what." They decided to follow the stream, hoping it would lead them back to civilization. But the forest was far from over with its ordeal. As they progressed, the friends found themselves in an increasingly strange and surreal landscape. Twisted trees, mysterious rocks, and a thick fog that obscured their path. Whatever held them captive in that dark forest was determined not to let them escape. Their lives hung in the balance, and the fight for survival against supernatural forces that had no intention of letting them go was just beginning. They were now faced with a nightmare from which they didn't know if they would be able to wake up.